Good afternoon, guys. I'm Chris Griffith. I'm the assistant manager and fish biologist at Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery. I've been working here since of February of last year, and before that, I was spending 5 years in Dworshak, Idaho, working for the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office. Before that, I spent 10 years in the Air Force. I got out and went back to school for environmental biology and ecology, and during that time, I was helping out with some translocations of fishes in Western Washington. I went to UNC Asheville, and I just kind of met one of the older guys there that was kind of heading the whole translocation, and he seemed like the happiest guy I had ever met in my life, and he was probably in his 50s. And for me, I'm like, hey, that seems like something I might want to do. I would like to work somewhere where I'm happy. My previous job wasn't really what I wanted, so I figured I would get into the fish and aquatics kind of career field. So currently we are rearing Springer Chinook salmon at Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery. Throughout the 80 plus years that the hatchery's been here, they've reared Chinook salmon. It could have been Springers, Falls, Summers. We've had steelhead reared here, coho, rainbow trout, and sockeye salmon. And the Yakima Nation, which is our partners, they spawn coho here and they acclimate coho here. So we have coho here on about 4 months out of the year as well. So at Leavenworth National Fish Hatchery, we raise 1.2 million spring Chinook salmon. And we currently have a few different ways of rearing fish. We have your traditional flow through system. It's just gravity fed. Pretty much you're getting water from the creek. It's going to the raceways via gravity and back out into the creek. And then we also have a new partial reuse aquaculture system where we can use up to 75% of our water to rear fish. So for us having these water issues, it's nice to be able to recycle some of our water. But as far as keeping the water cool or to increase DO, there's not a lot we can do outside in the traditional raceways. The most we can do is, add more water to increase the dissolved oxygen that the fish are intaking, so they're not getting to these like low minimal values that could potentially cause stress and harm on our fish. As far as the PRAS goes, we have the ability to temper our water with wells. We have 5 ground wells here, and we can supply somewhere around 4,000 gallons per minute to the hatchery. And currently in our PRAS, which is the aquaculture system, we use about 1,000 gallons of water compared to the traditional outside, which is 4,000 gallons. But we have the ability to temper with the well, and we can also add oxygen to our sumps to provide more oxygen to the fish. Just because we're reusing that water, so we're already stripping some of that oxygen out of that reused water. So it's good to be able to have the ability to add that oxygen if needed. For our nursery, for our little babies, we have well water that we use, and we also have a chiller. So we try to keep our fish during the first part of the rearing cycle when they're still eggs. We're keeping the water at about 39 to 40 degrees so we can slow the maturation process of these fish. And then the last thing that we have, which is probably not going to be sustainable in the future, is we actually have an alpine lake that we can hike up to in the enchantments and the Cascades, and we'll open up a valve and we can supplement Icicle Creek with up to 50 CFS, so about 20,000 gallons per minute of cool alpine water. And we use that in the summertime, one, to supplement flows because the flows get so low, and two, to just kind of provide that cooling effect. It's pretty minimal, but it does provide some cooling for our fish. We have all life cycles here. So we raise fish, release them as smolts, and they'll come back 1 to 3 years later as adults. We'll trap those in our fish trap that we have, and we'll spawn those and just go through the cycle again. And the regular rearing period for fish that we have here, let's say this year's brood was spawned in August, September, they'll be released in April of 2024 and then come back 1 to 3 years later as adults. Typically it's 2 years. That seems to be about 70 to 80% of the fish that come back, but we do get some one oceans and some three oceans. 3,000 to 5,000 eggs, sometimes less, sometimes a little more, really depending on, you know, conditions of the water they're in, size of the female, the resources they had while they're in the ocean. There's a lot of variables there, but yeah, we definitely have a lot of eggs. 0.5%. This year's brood, for example, they were spawned August, September of 2022, and they'll be released in April of 2024. So it's about 18 months rearing at the hatchery. Those get pumped right into Icicle Creek, travel 500 miles through 7 dams to get to the ocean, and 1 to 3 years later, they'll come back and do the same thing. And the cycle just continues at the hatchery. From this company called BioOrgan. They're based out of Longview, Washington. It's just pretty much dried pellets made mostly of fish meal, and they add fish oil and other supplements just to get the fish the nutrients they want. But the vast majority of it's just ground up fish, dried into pellets. So most of our stock came from Carson National Fish Hatchery back when we first started the program here. And since 1985, we haven't been using any gametes from any other hatcheries. So now we're calling the fish that returned back here is Leavenworth icicle stock. For like this particular hatchery, like genetics isn't a huge issue because we're not rearing fish for conservation so much. Like our hatchery is pretty much came and was established because we're mitigation for fish losses at the Grand Coulee Dam. So for us, our main purpose is to just create salmon for tribal sustenance and fishing and for sport fishing as well. Now there are other hatcheries that do work with more conservation and genetics. Like my last hatchery, we tracked genetics of fish from the spawn, having the male female partners all the way through the rearing cycle. And then when they come back as adults, we would actually take genetic samples as well. So there are places in the region that are looking at this and taking, like a big data bank of the genetics of fish. But for us, it's not a huge concern right now. But we do spawn 1 to 1, so one male to one female, just to increase the amount of genetic diversity that we do have in our fish. Kind of two reasons. One is because of our effluent. We have certain periods of the year we have two broods of fish on at the same time. So that increases our phosphorus effluent going to the creek. So we've kind of delayed this maturation of the juveniles so we can reduce the phosphorus loads, and also we just don't have the rearing space for 2.4, 2.6 million fish. So that's another reason why we delayed it as well. And it kind of more closely mimics more natural cycles of fish as well. So that's helpful. Just different runs of fish. So springers, they typically start making their way up the hydrocycle, like leaving the ocean and coming back to their reproduction areas. And March is usually about when they start making their trip up. The summers is usually June, July when they start making that, and then the falls come a little bit later, September, October. So it's just kind of based off the timing of these fish migrating back to their natural spawning habitats or to hatcheries. Springers taste the best, but they're also some of the most temperamental. Like they don't deal with disease as well as say the summers do, or just these vast temperature changes, dramatic temperature changes. They don't deal as well with it. And it's usually the first fish of the season, so it's quite important for the local tribes. Coho salmon, and it's a reintroduction program from the Yakama Nation. So really their hope is we'll get some more of those naturally spawning fish into the riverine systems. I don't know exactly what work they're doing as far as that goes. I know they do take genetic samples of the fish they spawn, but that's on the Yakama Nation side, so I can't say 100%. But we do have Endangered Species Act listed steelhead and bull trout in the icicle, so there is some conservation that we deal with. We're conserving fish for for sport and tribal fishing because they're hatchery fish, and we don't really want them to stay in the river system because it'll just take natural resources away from any wild spawning Chinook that could be in the area. So I guess really one of the few things we do is when we're trapping our fish, all of our fish get what's called a mark. We get the adipose fin and they get clipped off. So anyone that's fishing knows that these fish are hatchery fish, so they can actually take those. So when we're trapping our fish for spawning, if any adults have an adipose fin on those, we put them back into the river. We take a scale sample and length and check for any tags, and we'll put those back into the creek so they can spawn naturally. Our whole goal really is to have these fish naturally occurring, and maybe that means in the future that hatcheries don't exist and we lose a job, which I would actually be okay if that were to happen. But I have my serious doubts that it will. But yeah, the main thing is we want to keep these naturals and our hatchery fish separated just so they're not, occupying the same spaces and competing for the resources that are available. So last year we had a 2040 climate change assessment for Icicle Creek, and right now it's looking like come 2040 we're going to have as high as a 2 degrees centigrade increase in water temperatures and a 35% reduction in our mean monthly snowpack. So what that means for us is we're just going to have warmer water that's going to increase the amount of disease we have on our fish, increase the stress on our fish. And then with this reduction in snowpack, we're going to be losing a lot of this water in the summertime that's needed to, one, keep the stream cool and to just have enough water to keep our fish alive. So there are definitely some concerns, and that's part of the reason why we do have the PRAS is to lower the amount of water use that we have right now. I'd say one thing about hatcheries is I feel like they tend to get some bad stigma towards them. And I think a lot of that is just based on commercial fish hatcheries where all they're worried about is producing big fish as fast as they can to make money. Here's a little different. We have, multiple agencies watching what we do. We have metrics that we need to keep as far as the health of our fish, the survival of our fish once they're released, the amount of returns that come back for fishing. It's just mainly, I would just want to say that a lot of us that work at these hatcheries for mitigation or for conservation is because we really care about this species. Like we want these fish to still be here because I am concerned that 20, 50 years from now, there may be lower populations or no populations of these fish. Like myself, I'm not an angler, but I do like knowing that people can go out and fish for these salmon, and then just watching the tribes at the beginning of the year, they have their ceremonies, and just watching them at the hatchery fish, it makes me happy to see people enjoying this tradition that's been around for millennia, really. Fish and Wildlife Service celebrated their 150th year of national fish hatcheries this year. So the U.S. has been working to conserve fishes for 150 years and probably even earlier than that, but Fish and Wildlife Service 150 years now. So it's a problem that's been known for over a century, and I think it's going to be a problem probably throughout our lives.
It's a problem since we created it.
Exactly.
Problem as long as we keep creating them.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if like 50 years from now, people are going to look at what we were doing as hatcheries and just realizing that we did it completely wrong. And the thing is, we're just using the best knowledge, information available to raise these fish. Hopefully, we're doing it right. As far as I know, we are right now. So hopefully, it stays that way. But, I mean, that's what this is. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry to just put a band-aid on our problems.